They say blood is thicker than water. They say family is the one thing you can always come back to. But nobody tells you what happens when the people you gave everything to, your years, your savings, your silence, your sacrifice, look you in the eye over a bowl of cereal and say, "Mom, it's time you moved out." I couldn't believe it. Not the words exactly, but the tone. Casual. Decided. Like it had already been agreed upon in a room I hadn't been invited to. Here's what nobody talks about. The most shocking betrayal in a person's life rarely comes from an enemy. It comes from family, wrapped in the language of love, dressed in the clothing of concern, and delivered at the breakfast table before the toast has finished cooling. I had been cheated out of something I couldn't name at first. Then I realized they had tried to quietly strip me of my dignity, my legacy, my home, and called it kindness. They lied to themselves so thoroughly that they believed it. What happened next is the part they never saw coming. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't call a solicitor in a panic or beg for a conversation. Instead, I went very quiet. And when a woman who has spent 41 years building something finally goes quiet, really, truly quiet, that's not weakness. That's the sound of a decision being made, the kind that changes everything. I was humiliated in my own kitchen. I was shamed by my own son in a house that had my fingerprints on every wall. And then, I sold it. I started the sale while he was at work. And I finished it before he ever realized I'd moved the first piece. And what I did next, and what I discovered in the process about sacrifice and karma, and what real justice looks like, that's a story I need to tell you. Because if you've ever been made to feel invisible by the people who should have seen you most clearly, then what I'm about to share isn't just my story, it's yours too. It was a Tuesday morning, and I remember the smell of toast burning just slightly on the edges. The kind of smell that feels like home. I was sitting at my own kitchen table, the one I picked out with my late husband, Edwin, 32 years ago, when my son Daniel said it without even looking up from his phone. "Mom, I think it's time we talk about you finding your own place." I couldn't believe it. My own place. As if this wasn't already mine. He used words like, "your well-being and a fresh start," and "it'd be best for someone your age." His wife, Serena, just sat there stirring her coffee. No eye contact, no reaction, like she'd rehearsed this moment 100 times without me. The betrayal didn't arrive with a shout or a slammed door. It came in the same tone you'd use to suggest changing a cable plan. That's the thing about family betrayal. It rarely sounds like war. It sounds like breakfast. I sat there and let the silence stretch between us like a crack in old wood. Part of me wanted to say something sharp, something that would cut clean and leave a mark. But the words just didn't come. Because it wasn't anger I felt first. It was something stranger, something heavier. It felt like being erased while still sitting in the room, humiliated in the quietest possible way. Daniel leaned back in his chair like a man who'd already decided the meeting was over. "There are some really nice senior communities in Millbrook," he said, with this half-smile that I think was supposed to be reassuring. I nodded. I actually nodded, not because I agreed, but because I needed to think, and thinking required me to stop reacting. Anger takes energy, and I wasn't about to spend mine on a Tuesday morning over cold eggs. What no one at that table understood was that I wasn't done. Not even close. They had treated me like a piece of furniture past its use, something to be politely moved to a different room and forgotten. They had lied to themselves into thinking this was kindness. But here's the thing about women who've been quietly strong for decades. When we finally move, we move in ways nobody sees coming. And I hadn't even gotten up from that chair yet. After Daniel left for work and Serena disappeared upstairs, I walked through the house slowly, room by room, like I was reading a book I'd written with my own hands. The living room ceiling had a small water stain near the window that Edwin and I patched together in 1989, with a borrowed ladder and too much laughter. The hallway still had a faint scuff mark where Daniel used to drag his school bag every afternoon. 41 years. 41 years of life pressed into these walls. This wasn't just property. This house was the physical proof that I had existed, that I had sacrificed, that I had loved. Every corner held a decision. The kitchen tiles I chose over 3 weekends of samples. The garden out back that I nursed through 2 droughts and 1 bad winter. When you build something slowly and with intention, it doesn't just become yours, it becomes you. And they wanted to take it from me like it was a lease they were not renewing. I ran my hand along the banister, the one Edwin refinished the summer before he got sick. I remembered the sawdust on his hands, the way he hummed while he worked. The self-worth I had poured into this place wasn't something I could pack into a suitcase and move to a senior community in Millbrook. You don't just relocate a life. You don't just leave behind 30 years of muscle memory and call it a fresh start. The truth is, they weren't moving me. They were erasing me. I stood in the doorway of what used to be Daniel's childhood bedroom, now a home office with Serena's yoga mat in the corner, and I felt something shift inside me. Not sadness, not rage, something colder, cleaner. Like the moment before a storm when the air goes very still and the birds stop singing. The family drama that had played out at the breakfast table was still echoing in my chest, but my mind had gone somewhere else entirely. Somewhere quiet and purposeful. They had no idea what those walls meant. They had never once stopped to ask. And maybe that was the most shocking part of all. Not that they wanted me gone, but that they had lived here alongside me all this time and never truly seen what I had built. I was beginning to understand that some people can only recognize the value of something after it's been taken away from them. And that realization, slow and steady, was the beginning of something I hadn't planned, but couldn't stop now. There's a drawer in the old writing desk in the hallway, the one nobody ever opens, that I hadn't touched in years. I don't know exactly why I went to it that afternoon, maybe instinct, maybe grief. But I pulled it open, and there they were. Receipts, bank statements, handwritten checks, folded loan documents with my signature on every line. $4,000 for Daniel's first car, $12,000 for the medical bills when his appendix ruptured and he had no insurance. The down payment on the house he and Serena now lived in before they moved into mine. I spread them across the kitchen table one by one, like a deck of cards in a game I hadn't known I was playing. The numbers added up to something staggering, not just financially, but emotionally. Every one of those figures was a moment where I had chosen him over myself, where I had quietly emptied my savings, my reserves, my sense of dignity, to make sure my son didn't fall. And not once, not a single time, had he ever said, "Mom, you didn't have to do that." Because to him, it was expected. It was just what I did. That's the thing about quiet sacrifice. It becomes invisible over time. People stop seeing the effort and start seeing the result. He didn't see a mother who had stretched every dollar and said no to herself 1,000 times. He saw a woman with a house and time on her hands, someone whose usefulness had reached its expiration date. The lied-to person in this story wasn't Serena or Daniel. It was me. I had lied to myself into thinking that love freely given would be love fully received. And I never reminded him. I never itemized my love. Family betrayal rarely arrives with a warning. It builds in silence. I sat at that table for a long time, not crying, past crying, just looking at the evidence of a life spent giving. There's a particular kind of shame that comes not from what others have done to you, but from recognizing how long you allowed it. I had been cheated out of being seen, not by a stranger, by my own blood. The karma of silence is that eventually, silence speaks for itself, loudly, and in ways you cannot take back. I put the receipts back in the drawer, but I didn't close it all the way. I left it open, just a crack, like a door I wasn't finished walking through. Because something in me had already made a decision, though my brain hadn't caught up yet. The question wasn't whether I would respond to what Daniel had said that morning. The question was how. And for the first time in years, I felt something awaken in me that had been sleeping for far too long. I didn't call Daniel back. I didn't leave a note. I didn't cry into a pillow or call my sister to vent. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea, Earl Grey, the loose-leaf kind I'd been saving, sat in my armchair by the window, and thought clearly for the first time in years. There's a difference between reacting and responding, and I had spent too much of my life reacting. Not this time. This time, I was going to be strategic, quiet, precise. The payback wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be permanent. I called Charlotte Pierce that evening. She'd been in real estate for over 20 years, sold half the properties in this part of Ashfield, and, most importantly, she was discreet. We had been friends since our children were in primary school together, and she was one of those rare people who understood exactly what you meant before you finished the sentence. "I want to sell the house," I told her. Quickly, quietly. No signs on the lawn, no open houses, only serious buyers. There was a pause on the line, then, "Margaret, I've been waiting years for you to do something like this." Charlotte came by the next morning while Daniel was at work and Serena was at her spin class. She walked through every room with that particular focused calm that professionals get when they know exactly what something is worth. She didn't gasp or gush. She just nodded, made notes, took a few photos with her phone. When she sat across from me at the kitchen table and named the figure, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Power. Not anger power. Not revenge screaming power. Clean, quiet, dignified power. The kind that comes with knowing you hold all the cards and have decided to play them. What I was doing wasn't just about the house. It was about reclaiming something they had tried to quietly take. My agency, my dignity, my right to decide the story of my own life. They had framed my leaving as something inevitable, something kind, something for my benefit. The truth? It was convenience dressed as compassion, and I had nodded at that breakfast table not out of agreement, but out of strategy. Because the best vengeance, the kind that really lands, isn't the kind you announce. It's the kind that happens while the other person is still congratulating themselves. Charlotte left with her notebook and a handshake, and I stood alone in the house as the late afternoon light came through the kitchen window at that angle I had always loved. Golden, slanted, like the house was showing off. I let myself feel it. The grief and the clarity arriving at the same time, side by side, neither one canceling the other out. Something was coming. Something irreversible. And as I watched the dust move slowly in that familiar light, I understood that what I was about to do wasn't just selling a house. It was writing the final chapter, and this time I was holding the pen. Charlotte moved fast. Within a week, she had brought 3 offers to the table, all above asking. The first was a developer out of the city, a man named Hargreaves, who kept referring to the house as the lot, and talked about maximizing the footprint. I didn't even let Charlotte finish reading his proposal. The second was a young couple who seemed lovely, but I could tell from the way they looked at the kitchen that they were already mentally gutting it. They had that look, the kind people get when they see potential and see something to be erased. I wasn't interested. The third offer came from Elaine and Martin Okafor, a semi-retired couple from Bristol, who had been looking for a home in Ashfield for nearly 2 years. They came with Charlotte on a Thursday afternoon, and I watched them from the hallway before they knew I was there. Martin touched the banister with both hands. Elaine stood at the kitchen window and just looked at the garden for a long moment without saying anything. These people weren't looking for a project. They were looking for a home. The difference isn't in the square footage, it's in the eyes. We sat in the living room for almost 2 hours, not talking about price, talking about the house, about the light in the mornings, about the oak tree in the back that drops acorns every autumn without fail, about the way the heating system makes a particular sound in January that you only notice the second winter. They listened. They asked questions. Martin told me they planned to plant a vegetable garden in the south corner, exactly where Edwin and I had always talked about doing one and never got around to. I didn't mention that, but I felt it. I told them about the water stain on the ceiling and the original tiles under the bathroom linoleum. I told them about the drafty window in the second bedroom that needed a specific angle to close properly. I told them everything. Not because I had to, but because I wanted this house to be known by the people who would live in it. Because what Daniel had never understood was that you don't just buy a home, you inherit a responsibility. And the Okafors, I could tell, were the kind of people who understood that. When they left, Charlotte looked at me with one eyebrow raised. "Well," she said. I told her to send them the offer with my conditions attached. The house would be sold, but it would be sold to people who would love it the way it deserved to be loved. There was a justice in that. A quiet, clean justice that no court could have delivered. And as Charlotte called them with the news, I was already thinking about the next step. The part that Daniel still had no idea was coming. Charlotte had the contracts drawn up within 3 days. She moved like someone who understood that time was not a luxury I could afford. I signed them at her office on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting across from her with a cup of tea I barely touched and a pen that felt heavier than any pen should. My conditions were structured through a restrictive covenant attached to the title: the garden to be maintained, the exterior character of the property preserved, and the oak tree. I had it written in explicitly. The oak tree was not to be removed under any circumstances. Charlotte had looked at me over the contract when she read that clause. I just said, "It's staying. Make it legal." After the sale was finalized, I called a solicitor I trusted. A woman named Patricia Webb, who had handled Edwin's estate and had never once made me feel small in a legal office. I told her what I needed: a living trust, set up immediately, with my granddaughter Rosa as the primary beneficiary. Rosa, Daniel's daughter, though she didn't know it yet, was 17, sharp, and entirely too good for the environment she was growing up in. She had my eyes and Edwin's stubbornness, and I wasn't about to let the fallout from this situation reach her unprepared. The trust was designed quietly and carefully. A portion of the sale proceeds, protected in an account that Daniel couldn't access, couldn't successfully contest, couldn't touch. Rosa would receive it when she turned 25, with a letter from me explaining everything, in my own words, at a moment in her life when she'd be old enough to understand and young enough to use it. The truth would reach her eventually. I just needed to make sure it reached her with dignity intact, mine and hers. I don't think people understand what it means to act from reclaiming rather than from rage. Anyone can react. Anyone can scream or accuse or send a long text message at 2 a.m. What takes real discipline, what takes self-worth, is building something new in silence before the old thing has even finished falling. That's what those signatures were. Not an ending, a foundation. A quiet act of justice that no one would see until it was already done. I drove home that evening and made a simple supper: soup from scratch, bread from the bakery at the end of the road. I ate alone at the kitchen table, looking at the walls I had loved for 41 years, knowing that tomorrow would be different, knowing that I had already made the move that could not be unmade. Somewhere across the city, Daniel was still living his normal day, unaware that everything had already changed. And I sat with that knowledge, warm as the soup, quiet as the house, and let myself feel, for the first time in a long time, absolutely certain. I didn't pack dramatically. No tearful goodbyes to empty rooms. No last look at every corner like a scene from a film. I had spent 3 quiet mornings moving only what truly mattered: Edwin's watch, the photo albums, my grandmother's embroidered tablecloth, the letters I'd kept in a shoebox for 30 years. The things that carry memory in their weight. Everything else, the furniture, the curtains, the rest, I left. I'd already had most of it collected, donated, sold, or taken away, because I didn't want to leave behind another claim they could cling to. The morning I left for the last time, I placed 2 things on the kitchen table: the sale agreement and Charlotte's contact number, written on a note card in my clearest handwriting. No note explaining myself, no paragraph justifying what I had done. They hadn't offered me an explanation when they delivered that breakfast table sentence, and I owed them nothing in return. The paperwork was explanation enough. The truth, when it arrived, would speak entirely for itself. I dropped the house keys through the mail slot on my way out. One set, clean, no ceremony. I heard them hit the floor on the other side with a sound I will never forget. Not loud, just final, like a full stop at the end of a long, long sentence. I walked to my car, put it in drive, and left Ashfield. Not in a rush, not in tears, but with the specific kind of calm that comes after making a decision you've been building toward for longer than you realized. I checked into the Wren, a small inn in a village called Thornley, about 40 minutes outside of the city, under my maiden name, Margaret Holt, not Margaret Calloway, not Daniel's mother, Margaret Holt. A woman who had existed before all of this, and would continue to exist long after. The room was small and faced the garden and smelled like lavender and old radiators, and I sat on the edge of the bed and thought, this is mine. This small, quiet room is entirely, uncomplicatedly mine. By that evening, I had a glass of wine, a library book, and the first full night of uninterrupted sleep I could remember having in years. No footsteps overhead, no voices in the kitchen that stopped when I walked in. No feeling of being tolerated in a space I had built. Just silence, the good kind, the earned kind. I didn't know it then, but in less than 12 hours, my phone would become a siren. The shockwave was coming. I just wasn't there to feel it. My phone started ringing at 6:47 in the evening. Daniel. I watched the screen glow and vibrate on the inn's bedside table, and I let it ring. Then it rang again. Then a text, all capitals, which told me everything. Mom, what is this call me now? Then Serena. Margaret, this is completely unacceptable. We need to talk. Then Daniel again, his voice in a voicemail cracking in a way I hadn't heard since he was 16. You sold the house? You actually… Mum, call me now. I couldn't believe how quickly it had all unraveled for them. How quickly the convenience had collapsed. What struck me, and I want you to really hear this, was what they didn't say. Not a single message asked if I was okay. Not one. Not, where are you? Are you safe? Not, Mum, I'm worried about you. It was all, we had plans, you had no right. Do you know what this does to us? The betrayal had always been there, but those messages made it undeniable. This had never been about my well-being. It had never been about my fresh start. It had been about their plan for the property. And I had simply been an inconvenience they had wrapped in the language of care. By the next morning, 23 missed calls, 6 voicemails, 14 texts. I read them all, not because I needed convincing, but because I wanted to understand clearly what I was dealing with. Serena's messages were colder, more legalistic. This may have implications. Our solicitor will be in touch. Daniel's shifted from anger to something that sounded almost like grief, though I couldn't tell yet if he was grieving me or grieving the house and what it had represented for him financially. There's a difference. A significant one. I didn't respond to any of it that first day. I went for a long walk through Thornley, down the high street, past the bakery, along the canal path. And I let the air hit my face and thought about what karma actually looks like when it arrives. It doesn't always come as a catastrophe. Sometimes it comes as a kitchen table with 2 pieces of paper on it and a set of keys that hit the floor and don't bounce. Sometimes justice is simply the moment someone finally experiences the disorientation they spent years making you feel. By evening, Daniel's messages had shifted again. Softer now, more confused than angry, edging toward something that might have been remorse but hadn't quite got there yet. I set my phone face down on the windowsill and went back to my library book. Outside, the village was quiet and amber under the streetlights. I was not shamed, not humiliated, not diminished. I was exactly where I had chosen to be. And the next move, the one I had been waiting to make in person, was already taking shape. I drove back to the house on a Thursday morning, 8 days after I'd left. I wasn't sure he'd be there, but something told me he would be. For a moment, I almost wished he wouldn't. Daniel's car was in the driveway, which surprised me only a little. The sold sign that Charlotte had placed once contracts were exchanged stood at the front, clean and final, and it looked more permanent than anything I had ever seen. The house already had the particular stillness of a place in transition, no longer fully belonging to the past, not yet given to the future. He was standing in the empty living room when I walked in. I'd already had the furniture collected in the days before I left, so the rooms were bare, stage clean, stripped of every object that might have given him something to hold on to. The Okafors wouldn't take possession for another 3 weeks, so the key Charlotte had provided for my final collection of a few remaining items still worked. Daniel turned when he heard my footsteps, and the look on his face, I want to be precise about this, wasn't rage. It was shock. The specific shock of someone who has realized for the first time that they had miscalculated the person standing in front of them. That's a very particular kind of humiliation. The backstabbed feeling, reversed. We stood in that empty room for a long moment without speaking. He looked smaller than usual, or maybe the room just felt larger without furniture. He started with, "How could you?" And I simply held up one hand, not aggressively, calmly. The way you stop a conversation that's about to go somewhere neither of you need to go. And I said to him very quietly, "You made me feel like a stranger in my own home, Daniel. You made a decision about my life at a breakfast table like I wasn't a full person anymore. I just returned the experience." He said things. I let him say them. He talked about disrespect, about legal challenges. Though Charlotte had made sure everything was airtight, and his solicitor had already confirmed as much. He talked about what he'd planned. And then, mid-sentence, his hand moved to the banister at the foot of the stairs. The one Edwin had refinished. The one Martin Okafor had touched with both hands the day he fell in love with the house. And something in Daniel's face changed. Like he was only now understanding what he had dismissed without ever reading. I told him the truth. Not vindictively, not triumphantly, just clearly, the way the truth deserves to be told. I told him about the receipts in the drawer, about the breakfast table, about Serena's eyes never meeting mine, about the 41 years I had given to that house and to him. I told him that reclaiming your dignity is not the same as revenge, and that if he could learn the difference, there might still be something worth rebuilding between us. Then I collected my final box, walked past him, and left. And for the first time in a very long time, I did not look back. The cottage I found in Thornley was nothing like the house in Ashfield, and that was exactly the point. Smaller, quieter. A kitchen that got the morning light just right. A back garden with enough space for a few raised beds if I ever got around to it. I moved in on a Saturday with 4 boxes and a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. No one had chosen this place for me. No one had suggested it was best for my age. I had found it, viewed it, liked it, and signed the lease in my own name. That act alone felt like reclaiming something I hadn't realized I'd given away. I rebuilt my routines slowly and deliberately. Morning tea at the kitchen table with the radio on low. Walks along the canal in the early afternoon. A Wednesday evening watercolor class I'd been meaning to take for a decade. Small things, perhaps, but each one a brick in something new, something solid, something entirely mine. Self-worth, I've come to understand, isn't rebuilt in grand gestures. It's rebuilt in the repetition of honoring yourself in ordinary moments. In choosing, again and again, to act like someone whose time and peace and preferences matter. Rosa found me 3 weeks after I moved in. She'd gotten my number from Charlotte, with my permission, and had texted with a careful, thoughtful message that read more like her grandfather than her father. We met for tea at the bakery in the village, and she sat across from me with those familiar eyes and said, "I always knew something wasn't right, Nan." She didn't ask for the full story yet. She was too wise for that somehow. But she held my hand across the table, and I felt the generational thread between us, unbroken. The trust I'd set up for her would be waiting when the time was right. The truth would reach her whole. Daniel came to see me 6 weeks later. No call ahead, just a car in the lane and a knock at the door. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. He didn't bring Serena. He brought instead something harder to carry, the beginning of accountability. It wasn't a full apology, not yet, but it was honest in a way our conversations hadn't been in years. He said he'd been thinking about the receipts. He said he'd pulled them out of the drawer. He said quietly that he hadn't known. I told him I believed him, and that not knowing was also a choice. Just a slower, quieter one. We sat in the garden for an hour, and it was uncomfortable and necessary and real. Peace, I've learned, is not the absence of pain. It's not the tidy ending where everyone forgives everyone over a cup of tea, and the music swells, and the screen goes soft. Peace is knowing that you acted with integrity when you could have acted with cruelty. It's choosing legacy over vengeance, dignity over drama, clarity over chaos. The karma that I'd been afraid might never arrive had come. Not as destruction, but as transformation. I had been backstabbed in my own kitchen, and I had responded not with fire, but with architecture. I had built something new from the rubble of what they thought would bury me. And sitting in my garden in Thornley, with the afternoon light on the hedges and Rose's laughter still in my ears, I understood something that no one could take away. I had won. Not because they had lost, but because I had finally, fully come back to myself. So here we are. At the end of a story that started with a bowl of cereal and a sentence that was meant to diminish me, and ended in a cottage in Thornley with morning light through the kitchen window and, for the first time in years, genuine peace. I wasn't destroyed by the betrayal. I was clarified by it. I didn't take revenge. I took back my life. And the difference between those two things is everything. But before I go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. Have you ever made a sacrifice for someone you loved, quietly and without announcement, only to find that it was taken for granted? Have you ever been made to feel like a burden in a space you built with your own hands? Have you ever been cheated out of being seen by the very people who were supposed to know you best? Because I think more people know this story than they let on. I think there are people watching right now who have their own drawer full of receipts, metaphorical or literal, their own breakfast table moment, their own version of, "It's time you moved out." And if that's you, I want to hear from you. Drop your story in the comments below. Tell me what you did. Tell me what you wish you'd done. Tell me if you're still in the middle of it. Because this community, right here, is a space where your experience matters, where your pain is real, and where justice, even the quiet, hard-won kind, is worth talking about. Did Margaret do the right thing? Should she have confronted Daniel sooner, or was the silence the most powerful move she could have made? And what about Serena? Was she villain, coward, or something more complicated? Let's talk. Leave your thoughts below and don't hold back. The most honest comments always start the best conversations. And if this story moved you, unsettled you, or made you feel something you needed to feel, then you already know what to do. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because what we do here isn't entertainment. It's excavation. Every week we go deeper into the stories that family gatherings don't talk about, the dynamics, the betrayals, the quiet reckonings, and the extraordinary, ordinary people who refuse to be written out of their own lives. You don't want to miss what's coming next. I promise you, it's going to hit differently.